A sudden heavy silence fell over St. Peter's Basilica, wrapping the massive space in an uneasy tension as you and I watch a moment that nearly broke the Vatican. 5,000 spectators held their breath, staring at 10 young men kneeling on the cold stone floor, while Pope Leo XIV stood before them, holding nothing but a single, plain sheet of paper. When the pontiff raised his eyes, the words that followed seemed to freeze the blood of every cardinal present. For weeks, the inner circles had been left in the dark about what the Pope planned to say. What was meant to be a routine ordination homily had secretly transformed into a devastating, direct challenge to the Roman Curia itself.
To support our investigative journey into these hidden truths, please take a brief moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment showing where you are tuning in from. Our investigation takes us back to April 23, 2026, when the papal aircraft touched down in Rome. Pope Leo XIV had just completed a grueling 11-day tour across Africa, visiting communities in Algeria, Cameroon, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea. He returned a vastly different man. He had witnessed desperate poverty, shoeless children, and starving mothers. His staff immediately saw the shift. He moved with a heavy slowness, remained silent, and stared blankly for hours out the window during the flight home. A remarkably brief welcome ceremony marked the pontiff's return to Roman soil. Though a delegation of anxious cardinals greeted him on the tarmac, he offered only a fleeting smile and a quick blessing before rushing into his waiting vehicle. He bypassed the usual social protocols and went straight to his private quarters, refusing dinner, meetings, and the thick briefing binders left on his desk. Behind the locked doors of his study at the Domus Sanctae Marthae, with only a single desk lamp illuminating the room, he began to write. He had just 3 days before Good Shepherd Sunday, when 10 deacons would be ordained in front of 5,000 people and global television cameras. He worked completely alone, pen in hand. The Pope worked in total isolation, refusing the help of any theological advisors or personal assistants. By the time dawn broke, the study floor was littered with crumpled, discarded sheets of yellow paper. Entering the room at 6 in the morning, the Pope's private secretary stopped dead in his tracks, upon realizing his superior had not slept a single wink. Although the secretary gently urged him to rest, the Pope kept writing, stating firmly that this message had to be perfect. Peering at the draft, the secretary's expression hardened as he read the unusually sharp, confrontational tone of the text. Recognizing the storm that was brewing, the aide quietly set down an espresso and slipped out of the room. Pausing in the quiet corridor outside, the secretary leaned heavily against the cold wall to process what he had just seen. For almost 1 year, he had worked closely with the pontiff, translating and editing hundreds of documents for world leaders, prisoners, and local families. Yet he had never witnessed the Holy Father draft a message with such raw, unvarnished intensity. It was clear that the painful realities of the African trip had ignited a fire that the Pope was finally letting loose. By midday, whispering officials throughout the Roman Curia realized that something incredibly radical was being composed upstairs, and that no one would be permitted to water down the message. Resistance began with an influential high-ranking cardinal of the Roman Curia, who had served 3 previous administrations and held immense sway over papal texts. After his initial meeting request was rejected, he persisted until he was granted a strict 5-minute audience. He entered the office to find Pope Leo XIV staring silently out the window at the gardens below. Placing a leather folder onto the desk, the cardinal warned the Pope that the upcoming homily would provoke rather than bring peace. When the Pope challenged him to define what true peace meant, the veteran cardinal admitted that to the Curia, peace meant comfort and not shaking the foundations of the Church. Staring intensely at the senior prelate, Pope Leo XIV let a long, heavy silence fill the room. He stepped over to his desk, picked up the handwritten draft, and commanded the cardinal to read it. As the veteran official read the pages, his hands began to visibly shake, prompting him to warn that the message would be poorly received. The Pope met this warning with a tired, knowing smile, declaring that such a reaction proved the homily was absolutely necessary.
Though the cardinal departed in silence, he immediately shared the contents with 3 other high-ranking prelates. By that evening, a covert phone call was already being placed from a secure luxury apartment overlooking the Vatican.
That clandestine telephone call lasted exactly 9 minutes, setting off a chain reaction behind closed doors. While the precise details of their discussion remain unknown, the resulting panic was unmistakable. 2 highly secretive, unrecorded meetings were convened that very night in windowless rooms. By Friday morning, a faction of panicked senior officials agreed they must force a change to the homily. Blocked from approaching the unyielding Pope directly, they chose a much more vulnerable target, the 10 young ordinands preparing for their big day. These nervous men, some of whom had spent over a decade preparing for this moment, were currently gathered in a nearby guest house. As the young candidates waited in anticipation, 2 high-ranking cardinals arrived unannounced at their door on Friday morning. The young men quickly rose in deep respect as the visitors entered with warm smiles and formal blessings. Once seated, the senior prelates revealed their true motive, warning the candidates that the Pope's Sunday address would feature incredibly provocative language. They urged the young men to separate their lifelong priestly vocations from whatever political storm might erupt during the ceremony. The room became deathly quiet until one young ordinand from Rome spoke up, demanding to know exactly what the cardinals meant by the term stronger. The visiting cardinal offered only a cold, calculating stare before responding with a cryptic warning. After giving a final, brief blessing, the prelates exited, leaving a heavy fog of anxiety in the room. The young men sat in stunned silence, completely paralyzed by the terrifying question of what Pope Leo planned to say to the world. For hours they paced the room, mindlessly flipping through Bibles or staring out the window, trying to stop their hands from shaking. Eventually, the oldest candidate, who had studied 15 long years for this moment, pointed out that they would be standing on global television right as the explosive words were spoken. Looking up at his anxious brothers, another candidate urged everyone to brace themselves for the truth. In the quiet that followed, the youngest among them suggested that perhaps the Pope wanted them to hear the raw truths that the institution had suppressed for decades. Though no one spoke, their silent agreement was palpable as the rumor began leaking out into the secular world. By the following morning, a prominent Italian newspaper published a brief, anonymous article containing a single explosive sentence. It hinted that the Pope's homily would deeply shock the global church. Within hours, the tiny column was translated into 11 languages, capturing global attention. Dozens of international journalists who had ignored the upcoming ordination suddenly scrambled to book last-minute flights to Rome. As you and I look closer at this unfolding media circus, the stakes couldn't have been higher, with broadcast crews rerouting their cameras straight towards St. Peter's Square. What was supposed to be a sleepy morning liturgy had rapidly transformed into a global media event. In a small hotel room overlooking the Tiber, a veteran investigative journalist who had spent 20 years tracking Vatican secrets analyzed the leak. She knew most rumors were empty noise, but a select few changed history, prompting her to call 3 of her most reliable sources. A tense silence filled the line when her third contact finally spoke, offering a single, chilling instruction to ensure she was present in the Basilica on Sunday. When the line went dead, she opened a fresh document to draft an article that would shake the public. Stick with me, because this final confrontation is where the true battle for the Church began. By Saturday evening, as media pressure reached a boiling point, the senior cardinal made a final attempt to intervene. He met the Pope without folders or notes, sitting directly across from Leo XIV. With 40 years of Vatican service behind him, the cardinal prepared to make his final, desperate plea. Let us step inside the closed-door chambers of the Vatican, where a quiet but fierce battle of words was unfolding. An influential cardinal leaned forward, pleading with Pope Leo XIV to soften his upcoming sermon. The pontiff listened in absolute silence as the cardinal argued that while the message could remain, the harsh tone had to go. The church was fragile, numbers were falling, and believers were confused. They did not need a confrontation. Yet, When the Pope finally spoke, his question cut through the air like a knife, asking how they had reached this point. The cardinal blinked in confusion. The Pope quietly observed that the decline happened because, for too long, leaders had stood in the doorway, deciding who was worthy to enter. An oppressive silence settled over the room as the Pope made his intentions clear. This coming Sunday, he explained, he would ordain 10 young men who were bursting with faith and eager to serve the world. But before those ordinands departed St. Peter's Basilica, they needed a lesson they would never forget. They had to understand exactly what kind of priests the modern church was tired of harboring. Stunned by this raw honesty, the cardinal stared down at his hands in silence before rising, bowing stiffly and offering a quiet prayer for the Pope's words as he departed. When Saturday night arrived, a tense energy gripped Vatican City. Nobody slept as the final, elaborate decorations inside the historic basilica were carefully put into place. Every physical detail had been meticulously prepared, from the draped white silk to the polished silver chalice and the immaculate vestments waiting in the sacristy. Yet far from the physical grandeur, the Pope spent 2 hours kneeling in his private chapel, deep in prayer. Returning to his desk, he reviewed the draft of his homily one last time. He did not alter a single syllable. He simply folded the paper, slipped it into his cassock, and extinguished the lamp. When Sunday morning arrived on April 26, 2026, the faithful gathered under a dark sky. By 8 in the morning, the square was teeming, and by 9, 5,000 people, including diplomats, reporters, and clergy from around the globe, packed the majestic basilica. Tension filled the small room behind the altar, where the 10 ordinands waited in their pristine white robes. Enveloped in the heavy silence, these young men instinctively sensed that this ceremony would deviate from tradition. One candidate broke the quiet, reminding his brothers that regardless of the day's events, they would emerge as ordained priests. They silently joined hands, drawing strength from one another before stepping forward. As the clock struck 10, the solemn procession commenced under the booming resonance of the choir. Golden sunlight poured through the high windows, illuminating St. Peter's Basilica. Walking with deliberate slowness down the central aisle, the Pope bypassed the crowds, his eyes locked straight ahead. As the pontiff glided past the rows of red-robed cardinals, their anxious gazes tracked his every step. Some watched him with deep, traditional reverence, while others betrayed a profound undercurrent of worry. They looked at him the way one watches a man about to perform an act that cannot be stopped. Upon reaching the high altar, the liturgy commenced with solemn opening prayers and scripture readings. Then the Gospel of the Good Shepherd was proclaimed, highlighting the striking image of Christ as the gate. It was a potent metaphor of doors that should welcome believers, but are instead barred by the very gatekeepers sworn to guard them. When the final verse faded, a heavy hush fell over the crowd as Pope Leo XIV rose to speak. Seated at the front of the altar, the Pope quietly smoothed the folded paper across his knee before beginning. His initial words hummed softly through the microphone, celebrating a Sunday full of life. This gentle start prompted a collective, relieved sigh from several nervous cardinals, who dared to hope that the troubling rumors had been overblown. But that fleeting sense of comfort evaporated when his tone hardened. Looking up, his piercing gaze locked directly onto the 10 candidates kneeling on the cold marble. He warned them that in an era where modern statistics show a growing chasm between the public and the church, they must keep the doors open. He commanded them to let the people in and be ready to step out themselves. Delivering what he called another secret for their lives, the Pope uttered a phrase that struck the room like lightning. "You are a channel, not a filter." Instantly, an icy stillness gripped St. Peter's Basilica. While there was no outward theatricality, the shift in atmospheric pressure was undeniable. Those simple, direct words cut straight to the core of a structural pathology the Vatican had harbored for generations. In the rear pews, a visiting deacon from Spain leaned forward in sheer disbelief, his jaw dropping slightly as he sought his companion's gaze. The older priest beside him merely nodded, his eyes glistening as if he had spent an entire lifetime waiting for a reigning pontiff to voice this profound truth. Over in the crowded press gallery, a veteran correspondent, who had spent the previous night drafting a standard, predictable lead, felt her breath catch in her throat. Her fingers suddenly flew across her phone, tapping out urgent updates faster than she had in decades, while the cardinals in the front pews sat like statues. Pope Leo did not offer them any reprieve. He explicitly commanded the new priests never to hide or obstruct the holy door, warning them not to become roadblocks for those seeking God. Though his delivery remained steady, each syllable fell with the heavy impact of a stone. He looked at the candidates, declaring that they belonged to everyone, and urged them to keep the threshold wide open. An audience of 5,000 people hung on his every word in a state of absolute, breathless silence. Suddenly, the Pope pivoted to an unexpected and rarely cited scripture. In a hushed but clear voice, he quoted Christ's ancient warning that they themselves did not enter, and yet they actively blocked those who were trying to get in. This devastating indictment from the Gospel of Luke, aimed squarely at the self-righteous religious elite of antiquity, had not been uttered in a papal sermon in generations. The weight of the accusation was immediate. In the front rows, two prominent cardinals bowed their heads in deep, troubled contemplation, while the senior prelate, who had begged for a softer tone, slowly closed his eyes. You and I can almost feel the collective intake of breath as the Pope continued his relentless critique. He spoke openly of toxic communities that suffocate their members, noting that some religious groups are incredibly easy to join, but nearly impossible to leave. Such structures, he declared, do not represent the true Church of Christ. After a dramatic pause, he reminded the silent crowd that the faithful do not seek rigid instructions, but rather refuge and life. Turning his prepared notes, he challenged the new priests to find their security not in their institutional titles, but in Christ's resurrection. Then, in a theatrical shift that would define the entire day, he looked up and pushed his notes aside. Addressing the crowd completely from the heart, he spoke without relying on his prepared text. He implored his brothers not to act as gatekeepers who judge who is worthy to enter, but rather to be facilitators who help others cross the threshold. The resulting silence inside St. Peter's was so profound it felt physical. News cameras recorded the scene in silence, journalists froze, and the cardinals sat completely paralyzed. This was no carefully polished public relations script, but a raw conviction forged through decades of observation. Sitting back down, the Pope meticulously folded his paper to signal the start of the ordination, where the 10 candidates prostrated themselves on the cold marble floor. By the time the young men stood up, their identities had fundamentally changed, from deacons to ordained priests. Standing before the altar, they carried a heavy awareness that the radical message they had just witnessed would echo far beyond these stone walls. Once the Mass concluded, the solemn recessional began. The Pope departed with the same slow, deliberate pace as before, keeping his gaze fixed ahead and speaking to no one. This time, however, the cardinals observed him with a completely different mixture of shock and calculating dread. Outside the sanctuary, a global storm was already brewing. Within mere minutes of the final blessing, the phrase warning them to be channels rather than filters flooded the digital world. In less than 60 minutes, the Pope's words became the top trending topic across 15 different nations. Within 3 hours, global news syndicates had blasted the story to millions of screens. That afternoon, the Vatican press office quietly released the official transcript without adding any explanatory commentary or attempting to soften the blow. They simply let the raw text speak for itself, though the message had already bypassed traditional gates. Far from Rome, in a modest parish hall in Buenos Aires, about 40 locals gathered around a projector screen. Initially drawn by the sacred music and the visual majesty of St. Peter's, they had no idea they were about to witness history. The moment the Pope declared that priests must be channels rather than filters, an elderly woman in Buenos Aires stood up in the quiet hall. Clutching her worn rosary, she remained standing in absolute silence while her confused son looked on. When she finally spoke, Her fragile voice carried across the room, noting that she had not heard a pontiff speak with such clarity in 50 years. She sat back down to dry her eyes, her attention fixed entirely on her prayers. Meanwhile, in a Manila parish, a priest ordained just 3 years prior paused his live stream. He rewound and played the clip 3 times before opening his notebook to write it down. We are left to wonder what this spark will ignite. In a quiet chapel outside Mexico City, an elderly priest on the verge of retirement stared at a screen, his hand pressed over his mouth. The moment the homily ended, he stood up, walked to the back of the room, and phoned his bishop to say he was staying on. Meanwhile, inside the secure walls of the Vatican, a silent battle of whispers had begun. While some cardinals praised the message in private, others reacted with deep resentment. By Sunday evening, a tense gathering of prelates met in a secluded dining hall. Wine was poured but left untouched as the heavy doors were locked shut. "He has gone too far," one complained. "He spoke the truth," another countered. A third warned that this truth only served to humiliate them all. The defender of the sermon spoke up, arguing that the Pope did not humiliate anyone, but merely challenged them to remember their true calling. The first cardinal shook his head in disagreement, warning that these words would tear the Church apart. With a sad, knowing smile, the third prelate noted that the Church had been fractured for decades, and the Pope had simply exposed the wound. A heavy silence descended upon the table. Finally, the youngest bishop in the room, ordained less than 10 years, broke the quiet. He suggested they ask if they themselves had failed to go far enough. The older men stiffened at this challenge, demanding to know what he proposed they do. Looking them in the eye, the young man simply replied, "Not this." The young cardinal insisted they should stop whispering in dark rooms and drafting empty statements they would never publish. The Pope had spoken in St. Peter's before 5,000 people and the entire world. If they disagreed, they should do so openly, using their real names and voices. His challenge was met with dead silence. He raised his glass and took a drink while the debate drifted, though his question lingered in the air. Meanwhile, across the Vatican, the newly ordained priests finished celebrating their first Mass. Amidst the tears, laughter, and family blessings, the youngest priest sat quietly on a courtyard bench. When his older brother sat beside him and asked if he was okay, the young man did not answer right away. After a pause, the young priest whispered that he could not shake the Pope's words about being a channel rather than a filter. His brother nodded in quiet understanding. The newly ordained man confessed that while he did not know who he might disappoint, or whom he would be ordered to turn away, he was certain about the kind of priest he refused to become. Feeling a reassuring hand on his shoulder, the young priest gazed up at the emerging stars blanketed over Rome. He noted that the pontiff had given them both a sacred calling and a stark warning about what they must never become. Late that night, Pope Leo XIV returned to the Apostolic Palace, bypassing public messages and anxious cardinals, to pray in the quiet chapel of Santa Marta. The pontiff remained in the chapel for nearly an hour, lost in solitary prayer. Upon stepping back out, he stopped a young priest walking down the corridor. Caught off guard, the cleric froze before offering a deep bow. With a gentle smile, the Pope asked for his name, to which the man replied, "Father Giovanni." The Pope then asked if he was a channel, causing the young priest's eyes to well with a mixture of joy and fear. He promised to try, and with a slow nod, the Pope remarked that trying is all any of them could do, before continuing on his way. By Monday morning, April 27th, the Vatican faced a transformed reality as the homily reverberated globally, forcing distant bishops into either defensive statements, expressions of gratitude, or heavy silences. A rebuttal drafted by a faction of conservative leaders was edited, only to be quietly shelved. They realized that launching a public counteroffensive would only draw more attention to the Pope's message. Instead, the senior cardinal who had overseen the draft requested a private audience. He came carrying no list of objections, but rather a profound quiet. Sitting across from the leader who refused to dilute his words, the cardinal looked at the man whose sermon was still echoing around the globe. He spoke softly, offering a sincere apology. When the surprised Pope asked why, the cardinal confessed that he had mistakenly believed the Church needed comfort when it actually required the truth.
Pope Leo XIV studied his visitor for a long moment before leaning across his heavy desk to gently take the cardinal's hand. He explained softly that they both shared the same goal of protecting the Church. They had simply envisioned different paths to achieve it. The cardinal nodded in agreement, admitting that while he was old, he was not too old to learn. This brought a warm smile to the Pope, who remarked that they both still had work to do. As the cardinal stood, bowed, and prepared to exit, he paused at the threshold to ask if the Pope felt any fear. The pontiff pondered this before replying that he did not fear being misunderstood, but rather feared remaining silent while doors were shut. With a final nod, the cardinal departed.
On Tuesday morning, the Pope summoned the 10 newly ordained priests for individual private audiences, asking each of them a single question. What did you hear on Sunday? The responses varied. One spoke of open doors, another of light, and a third wept as he recalled his grandmother, who had abandoned the faith 20 years earlier after being made to feel unwelcome. The Pope listened in patient silence. Once the final priest departed, the pontiff sat alone until his secretary entered to report that the press was clamoring for a statement. The Pope shook his head, declaring the homily itself was the statement. When warned they would keep asking, he calmly dismissed the concern, prompting a final question about the reaction of the cardinals. The Pope quietly remarked that the cardinals would hear the message more than once, until they finally understood it. By midweek, the impact of his words had surpassed all Vatican projections. Catholic schools across 3 continents integrated the sermon into their lessons, and local priests quoted it during Wednesday services. In South America, a bishop posted a decree stating that from that day forward, no soul would ever be turned away from their doors. In distant cities, lay people repeated the phrase to friends debating a return to the Church. The words, "a channel, not a filter," transformed into a spiritual password, signaling hope. In Naples, a man who had avoided Mass for 20 years quietly stepped through church doors on Tuesday evening. Unsure of what to do, the visitor simply slipped into a pew at the back of the sanctuary. The priest, who was finishing the rosary with a few women, noticed him from the altar. He chose not to question the stranger, offering instead a single welcoming nod. Touched by this gesture, the man remained for the entire service. Similar quiet encounters began to multiply across the globe, shared in dozens of different languages. These occurrences were neither spectacular nor newsworthy, yet each served as a subtle confirmation of the vision Pope Leo XIV had articulated in Rome. Meanwhile, inside the secure offices of the Vatican, the pontiff steadily kept to his demanding schedule, as if nothing had altered. Our investigation reveals that the Pope focused on his duties, meeting with diplomats, blessing pilgrims, and answering letters. He made no further mention of his historic homily, knowing the message was already doing its work. Late one evening, 2 days before the end of April, the pontiff walked through the Vatican gardens, pausing at the window where the senior cardinal had once urged him to soften his tone. In the distance, a group of young seminarians passed by, laughing and holding a book, oblivious to his presence. They walked with the vibrant energy of people convinced they are destined to bring good into the world. Pope Leo watched them with deep, silent contemplation. In that quiet moment, he whispered a few words to himself, speaking with the exhaustion of an aging leader who remained entirely undefeated. "Keep the door open," he murmured. "Just keep the door open." With that final resolution, he turned and disappeared back inside. If this profound story has moved you, please take a brief moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments on what the phrase, "a channel, not a filter," truly means in your own life. Investigative narratives like this one are only able to continue because of dedicated viewers like you. We will accompany you on another deep search for truth in the next video.